In the Indian legal system, an annual family income of 8 lakh rupees triggers two opposing legal outcomes. Depending entirely on a citizen's demographic category, this single number either terminates or authorizes their eligibility for government benefits. For reserved categories, the 8 lakh threshold is an exclusionary barrier, removing access to seats set aside for their community. For the unreserved population, it performs the opposite function. Falling below this threshold activates a dedicated pool of seats they would otherwise be denied. To understand how one number can perform these conflicting roles, we have to look back to the drafting of the Constitution. The Constituent Assembly deliberately avoided using personal wealth as a primary metric for representation. Under the guidance of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, Articles 15 and 16 were designed specifically to address social and educational backwardness, conditions rooted in the historical legacy of untouchability, rather than modern bank balances. Examining the modern legal landscape requires deconstructing how the state eventually integrated economics through two distinct levers: the exclusionary filter of the creamy layer and the inclusionary gateway of the economically weaker section, or EWS. The Indian Constitution has evolved from a system based on a single variable of historical caste into a complex matrix. Today, the law treats wealth and poverty as distinct variables that interact with the citizen's ancestry to determine their rights. The integration of economics into this system began in the late 20th century. In 1980, the Mondal Commission identified over 3,700 groups as other backward classes, or OBCs. To improve representation for these groups, the Commission recommended a 27% reservation in government jobs and educational institutions. The implementation of these quotas led to the 1992 Indra Sawhney v. Union of India case, the landmark judgment that defines the boundaries of the reservation system. In this ruling, the court imposed a hard cap. Total reservations could not exceed 50% of available seats. They reasoned that equal opportunity would be compromised if affirmative action consumed the majority. The remaining 50% had to be preserved for open competition. This 50% ceiling became the most significant constraint in Indian law. It forced the government to find specific legal methods, often using economics, to expand the reach of reservations without violating the court's mathematical limit. The first major economic lever was the creamy layer. This judicially created concept identifies the socially advanced members of a backward class who no longer require state protection. The legal logic holds that individuals who have achieved economic parity should not consume quota benefits intended for the truly marginalized members of their community. This filter applies to children of high-ranking bureaucrats, military colonels, and constitutional functionaries. The income limit has been adjusted to reflect economic growth, starting at 1 lakh rupees in 1993 and rising to the current 8 lakh rupees in 2017. For decades, this economic exclusion was reserved exclusively for the OBC category. However, a major Supreme Court ruling in August 2024 shifted this policy. The court ruled that states must now identify and exclude the creamy layer within scheduled castes and scheduled tribes as well, ensuring benefits reach the most disadvantaged members of those groups. The creamy layer embeds a core principle into the Constitution. Historical marginalization does not provide a permanent claim to state aid. Once a family achieves a certain level of wealth, their constitutional protections as a backward class can be withdrawn. While the creamy layer uses income to exclude, the state introduced a second mechanism to include: the economically weaker section, or EWS. This document outlines the EWS criteria. It is a 10% reservation allocated strictly to the general category. To qualify, a family must earn less than 8 lakh rupees per year and must not already be covered under SC, ST, or OBC quotas. Official proxy data used by the government estimates the scale of this demographic. Approximately 18.2% of the general category population, roughly 35 million people, falls under the EWS income limit. Implementing this 10% quota created an immediate constitutional crisis. Adding it to the existing reservations meant the total reservation would reach 60%, mathematically breaking the Supreme Court's 50% ceiling. To make this legal, the government passed the 103rd Constitutional Amendment. By adding new clauses to Articles 15 and 16, They physically altered the Constitution to authorize this specific breach of the 50% limit. Through the 103rd Amendment, the state established that economic poverty is a standalone justification for affirmative action, even in the absence of historical caste-based discrimination. These two mechanisms, the exclusion of the wealthy and the inclusion of the poor, form a unified legal matrix. For reserved categories, the basis for aid remains social and educational history. However, the creamy layer acts as an economic filter that pushes people out of this quadrant if they achieve wealth. For the unreserved category, the 10% EWS quota sits in the purely economic quadrant. Here, income acts as the primary qualifier, pulling people into a system they were historically excluded from. The system designed by the Constituent Assembly to rectify the sins of untouchability has expanded. It now regulates contemporary wealth with the same rigor it uses to address historical ancestry. The Indian reservation system now operates as a multidimensional matrix. Ancestry provides the initial classification, but ongoing economic status determines whether those constitutional protections remain in force.